question, and which is all the more relevant as the initiators of the current invasion of Ukraine refer so much to history, and notably to the history of the Second World War. And from this point of view, the research we did, because now we cannot really anymore access to this archive, but the research we did is of the more relevant to try to look at the events with a scholarly approach. So today I'd like to present an argument that I made some time ago already when I did my PhD, and that I tried to refine since then, because it was already some years ago, through parallel work on the documentary, the Soviet documentary cinema about the war, the newsreels, notably on the front and the later use of these newsreels, and another project that Olga mentioned about the trials of Nazi or war criminals in the Soviet Union. So the conclusion I reached at that time, during the PhD time, and that found only confirmation later, is that the retribution of collaborators of the enemy and of the Nazi war criminals followed the classical logic of Stalinist mass repression, but the context of an ongoing conflict of unprecedented violence changed its course in significant ways. The first point was like pragmatic considerations about the need of manpower for the front, or for the need of manpower in other places like the Gulag camp of colonies, or also the villages of settlement of the Gulag, imposed a new balance between judicial prosecutions and other ways of repression, foreseeing more flexible outcome for the thousands of persons concerned. So this is the first significant change. The second thing is that after the Stalingrad turning point in early 1943, Moscow decided to use the solemnity of justice in the purpose of promoting a special war narrative. Both domestic and international considerations played a role in this change that we will look into now. And in turn, this change in the preoccupation for the war narrative propagated inside for the domestic audience and abroad contributed to the introduction of essential novelties in the general repressive campaign against the collaborators. A campaign that began 16 months ago in December 1941. So I just want to, before entering the case study and the sources, to remind that some words about the justice, notably the Stalinist justice, and how it can be studied. If we look at the functions of justice in this context, especially when justice had a public character, as several of the trials I'm going to present you, this justice revolves around three big goals purpose. The first one already evoked this morning is the purpose of reasserting norms, political, social, and cultural norms in a given society. In our example, it will be mainly reasserting political Soviet power and a way of communication between the population and the authorities after liberation. The second point can be, of course, punishing the violators of the law. And on this point, we must specify that the Soviet justice, due to its particular mission, substituted to the purpose of punishment that of political social eradication through work. That's why we had these labor camps and colonies. The idea of punishment and pain, suffering through punishment, was actively rejected in the first stage of Soviet power in favor of this idea of re-education through rehabilitation of a law worker. But at the same time, this could seem quite positive actually, but at the same time, the deeply political purpose of Soviet justice from the start also put aside the Western time concepts of rights of defendants, the contradictory procedure of establishing the judicial truth, and more generally, the état de droit, Rechtsstaat. Under Stalin, criminal justice came to be flexibly used by the political power to implement successive campaigns of social engineering. The third point that justice can serve, even under Stalin, is of course to bring into to the victims a feeling of recognition of the harm they endured and sometimes to compensate them. This feeling of retribution. We see this in practice in some civil cases during the years we're studying, but not in the criminal cases. There is a form of recognition of the victims, but which is quite ambivalent still in the 40s. The possibility of using criminal justice for a political agenda also favored the practice of using justice in public and in highly staged forms to promote narratives about unfolding events or recent past. Since 1928, the leadership resorted to public and mediatized trial to promote profiles of the inner enemy in forms where this inner enemy was always allied to external foes, adversaries, Germany, Japan, Poland, whomever, and to promote narratives of a radical fight of these enemies against the state of workers and laborers. These discursive constructions through the organization of public trials has been studied in its legal, or better say pseudo-legal dimension, in its media dimension, and even in its social resonance in the last 10 years. In this specific dimension of publicity and promotion of master narratives, pre-war Stalinist justice can be seen as converging with the historical justice of contemporary transition and post-conflict periods. Of course, the Stalinist didactic trial, to borrow from Lawrence Douglas his expression, the Stalinist didactic trial brought forward amazing narratives of crazy international anti-Soviet plots, betrayals up to the heart of the Communist Party, etc. But case and regional studies have shown its power of mobilization in the 30s already, if not of straightforward persuasion, in some specific instances. Just two examples before finally moving to the war period. Stephen Kotkin, in his well-known research on Magnitogorsk, convincingly argued that the public trials of regional leaders during the Great Terror in 1937-1938 met quite some success because beyond accusations of political betrayal, they also incriminated the defendants in abuses of power and other behavior that reflected some reality in the eyes of the population observing the trials. On the contrary, Wendy Goldman's study of how the workers of two big factories in Moscow reacted to the Moscow trials, the high-profile Moscow trials of 36, 37, and 38, her study shows differentiated responses to the complex and seemingly remote accusations raised against these former leaders of the Bolshevik Party. She shows also at the same time an appropriation at the local level of the purging and the indicting logic. So in this spirit, I tried to look at the war purges in my study. So the chronology and the conclusions I will present you today are based on a parallel examination of, on the one hand, the legal development and unfolding of this purge, as organized by the political authorities and how experienced by the people, the society. And on the other hand, that's why I've got two main blocks of sources, media, a reflection of this purge. The sources are detailed on the slide. The point of crossing these two lines was by that I came to conclude, studying this purge, that there was a direct link between the narrative that the state created about the war and about betrayal and about the crimes of the enemy, and the legal purge itself, how it evolved and how it became more nuanced actually, for which purpose. So, to do so, I looked at the role of the Soviet Union with central sources, but since it's really too wide and too diversified, and we have here different configurations depending on which kind of territory we're looking at. There are some common characteristics of the purge, but there are also some differences, and I focused on this western region of the Russian Federation, the Kalinin Oblast at the time, today GR region, that presents the advantages of being liberated very progressively from December 41 to the summer of 44. So we have a broad chronological overview of how the purge evolved and how also the social relations evolved during this period. But again, this is an entry in the question that does not pretend to be representative of the whole, and notably in the southern, in the Caucasus, North Caucasus, and in the western, notably the annexed territory, the logics went differently because there was the fight of Soviet power against the so-called nationalist resistance. So in the first period, we have straight from the start an attempt of the Soviet power to mediatize, to widely cover the crimes of the enemy. And these first attempts are contemporary of, in fact, the first war purges that unfolded in secrecy at first. So as first as the first territories were freed by the Red Army in December 41, the political police, following orders from Moscow, arrested all citizens suspected of having helped the enemy, contributing to his well-being on occupied territory, meaning distracting him by various cultural events or by prostitution, for instance, and finally having worked in various capacities in the occupation organs. The rigor and the haste of the first part of this purge proceedings can be explained by the wartime context, the launch of a campaign of vigilance in the pure Stalinist tradition, and also legal improvisation in the face of unprecedented crimes. But at the same time, Moscow began gathering very actively information about what was happening on occupied territory, and realized very quickly the potential for mobilization of all these stories and images revealing the barbarity of the enemy. The indignation provoked by the betrayal of one's own, and above all by the atrocities, as it was called, of the enemy, constituted a unique weapon of mobilization, both internally and externally, following, in a way, the examples of the First World War precedent. So on this slide, I show you one of the first kind of public exhibition panels showing photographs of the first crimes discovered by the Red Army and its photographer and cameraman in Kerch, in Crimea, in the winter of 41-42. And as you can see, this kind of public panels were displayed to the public with annotations orienting the reading to be made of it. And to this kind of public exposure of the crimes of the enemy, we have more elaborate also sources and tools like this album of about 50 pages that, as you can see, mix together what a seized photograph seized on the body of an enemy, of an execution, and a photograph taken already by Soviet photographs later, the liberation of an old woman who suffered from the occupation, who was injured and who also lost everything. And this photomontage had the purpose also of mobilizing the population, the soldiers, but also the rear, mobilization of the rear, to extract vengeance and retaliation from it. So this discourse denunciating the crimes of the enemy unfolded in the newspapers, the newsreels that were shown in cinemas, and also on the front through the use of mobile screening devices. Already in the summer of 41, the leadership had heard about the crimes committed in occupied territory by the enemy and his auxiliaries, and instructed its photographs and cameramen on the front to pay special attention to them and to record them. I also find in a private phone of a cameraman an April 42 documents of a hierarchy of a cinema production chain, explaining to this leader of the front team of cameramen that he had to pay special attention to the crimes against the Jews. So it was very well known, and already there was this worry of gathering evidence, or at least documents about it. So there was various order reiterated during the wars by various authorities, mainly the political board of the Red Army, from whom depended the journalists and the cameraman and all these media personnel on the front, to document the crimes. And this wide disclosure of crimes of the enemy at first went separately from the procedures against the collaborator that by that time were already running in high numbers but behind closed doors and through summary procedures, let's say. What is very important and interesting is to see that beginning with the spring of 1942, the discourse of the high authorities about the war purpose and the nature of the crimes of the enemy changed because of a preoccupation of the international audience and because of a new angle in its propaganda towards the international audience. And at the same time, we observe a first inflection of the purge itself behind closed doors against the collaborators, with the introduction in May 42 of the first nuance among collaborators, distinguishing some more involved and some lesser involved. And this tendency will grow more and more during the year 42 and even more in 43. Parallelly, in the press, following the first liberations of territory, the national and local press completed a gallery of portraits of traitors that had appeared but in a very marginal way during the summer and the autumn of 41, with new profiles, because the first very few articles that dealt with this kind of traitors in occupied territory were very schematical and kind of not based on a lot of stories, real stories. And they diversified these images, still at the same time elaborating a profile of the collaborators. If he was not himself from former enemy classes, because there was also this figure of collaborators, he shared with them some moral attributes, like the servility, canine servility towards the occupier, the worry for his skin instead of the community, and over the interest, the material interest, and cupidity, greed, etc. So the written word clearly constructed this binary opposition, while at the same time quite subtly diversifying the social profile of the occupier. So the kind of moral attributes came to become the characteristic of collaborators who in fact came from various backgrounds, and some were educated in fact under the Soviet Union, which was a problem, obviously, for the propaganda. But if the written word in the press could easily construct this binary opposition, the image that I looked in the archives, the raw footage that wasn't immediately used, could not so easily create the wanted image. And here I put for you shots from footage that was ultimately not released. It was there was a pre-editing of this footage, but the sound was never put on and it was not displayed publicly. It's a trial of early 44 in Melitopol, and what interests me at this point is the shot here of the collaborators. No, manage. The second shot on the higher group of four, showing the collaborators, and there is also close-ups on the face of the collaborators showing very ordinary, quite poor, humble Soviet banal citizens, with faces marked by the same difficulty of life as other Soviet citizens, and nothing specifically likely to embody what the press was describing about collaborators. So there was a problem with these kind of images, and it was necessary to organize them and to select them in another way to serve the purpose they were supposed to serve in the creation of a war narrative and the construction of the collaborator image. To acquire convincing force, the images would have to learn to express the vileness of the traitors through the hatred felt by their fellow citizens. So one of the ways used was to, in fact, decenter, not show so much the collaborators themselves because they were not expressing what was expected, but to show the rest of the crowd, the community, very, very angry at them, very full of hatred and wanting, demanding very harsh punishment. Above all, the justice and the media were soon invited to establish gradations. Above all, the tribunals, with the encouragement of the media, were invited to establish gradation of the crimes for better educational and propaganda effects. And here, I'm obliged to go very quickly through his conclusions, but the idea is that through 43, with 43, the year in which the war turned, there was also a turning point in the reflection about the punishment of the enemy's crimes and about the identity of the perpetrators. That had begun before. So this turn intersected with and encouraged a shift in the publicity given to the war purges, with an objective that was now more political than security related or military related. The Soviet successes simultaneously stimulated the mass arrest of suspected collaborators and enemy war criminals, foreign war criminals, and stimulated also a reversal of loyalties in favor of the Soviet. So, while maintaining an uncompromising line towards highly compromised traitors, Moscow began more and more to adopt a more pragmatic policy towards minor collaborators, or toward those who had sought to redeem themselves after, by, for instance, fighting in the partisan after having been on the bad side. And the courts were asked, therefore, to be more rigorous in examination of evidence, so as not to reduce diverse crimes to the same level. The Kremlin felt the need to distinguish between the more inhuman acts, both in their definition and in their punishment, and so to distinguish between those acts and overt facts of collaboration. So this pragmatic inflection of a war purge had domestic factors. There was this need of manpower. There was the necessity of taking into account a strategy of German occupying forces that enrolled forcefully a lot of young men on occupied territory to create the suspicion of the Soviet authorities. So the Soviet authority reacted by trying to be more discriminating than punishment of these people. Especially the national factor was observed as soon as the spring 43. The authorities knew that in the Baltics, notably, there was this policy of forced enrollments of young men in the German auxiliary forces and sometimes regular forces. And therefore, the retribution by the Soviet power was more discriminate and more thoughtful afterwards. And what I want to point here especially is the international factor. Beyond the domestic factors, there is this international factor. There is a reflection among the allies about the war crimes, the investigation of the war crimes. There is, the Soviet Union is unsatisfied because it wasn't invited, as you know, originally in the UNYCC, and it created its own commission that decided since November 42 to gather a lot of evidence about the crimes of the enemy. This commission, this extraordinary commission for investigating the Nazi crime, became a new actor, quite an important actor into the Soviet purge process. The military courts, indeed, were ordered to pass on to it any information on enemy war crimes that the legal cases provided with. And the extraordinary commission services were ordered in a response way, particularly, to provide it with all the necessary assistance. This happened at the same time, the implementation on the ground of this commission, this local organs of this extraordinary commission, happened at the same time as an important reform of the security institutions wanted by Stalin, because the reversal of the military situation pushed the dictator to reunite the functions of defense and counter-espionage, and to, on the contrary, separate those of internal and external police. The two lines, the lines of tracking down traitors on the one hand, and the line of tracking down war criminals or spies, began to separate at this point, while being still in the general broad frames of the war purges. And the purge against the collaborators was strongly influenced and nuanced by this new priority given to the prosecution of war crimes and the publicity, notably international, given to them. we know, a new law was redacted in April 1943 to correspond to the seriousness of the crimes and also to adapt new penalties, and here the idea of punishment was really clearly stated. Death by hanging for the most involved perpetrators, and hard labor, new type of hard labor, reminding the Tsarist Katorga hard labor. So really a clear break with the Soviet re-educative policy were created. And these legal developments found their application in the number. It was not, of course, a straightforward process. There was a lot of misunderstanding between the first instance courts, the higher instance courts, and the political authorities also applying their wish. But what is important in this thing is that the text emanating from Moscow about these changes in the war purge were validated first by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs before the Justice, Prosecutor's Office, or whatever else actors. It was really an international matter that was here looked at. And as I show on the slide, from then on, there was a new demonstrativity in the prosecution of the crimes. So there were two ways. There was the kind of simple village way, as you can see on the left photo, with hanging in the middle of the village like that, in front of the village population. And there was the more stage and perfection and stage organized way, theatrical way, with big trials of Krasnodar in July 1943, and here on the slide is Kharkiv in December 1943. Such very high-profile trials happened again in parallel of Nuremberg in 45, in the winter of 45-46 in other cities of the Soviet Union. And this new visibility given to the prosecution and, most importantly, the execution of the perpetrators followed various level of mediatization, but with some trials that were really heavily mediatized, like the Krasnodar and Kharkiv. The film about the Kharkiv trial was, as you may know, seen and commented by Jackson, the US party in the Nuremberg trial. And they published a lot of booklets about these trials in various languages. It was really heavily mediatized. At another level, the level of the photo on the left part of the slide, there were a lot of prosecution at the local level with public audience, and we have some evidence of that, but that were not much mediatized in the press, and that did not reach any kind of higher level, all union level, or even less international level. But there were, for the local communities, a publicity of the punishment. And finally, behind all that, still behind closed doors, there was hundreds of thousands of people who were still punished more or less in secrecy with extrajudicial procedures. They were sent in labor battalions, they were sent in the Gulag through various kind of texts taken between 44 and 45. These remained other levels of collaboration that did not serve the purpose of this master narrative. This master narrative, as you understand, had for its main pitch the idea of the barbarity of the crimes committed by the enemy, and several studies have shown the complex trace of the Holocaust in this overall set of crimes that were shown in this process, in these trials. There was also, in recent works, there were by Tanya Penton notably, and by Irina Rebrova and Natalie Moine, a specific attention given to the victims, the sick children, or the victims of permanent disease, incurable disease, etc. But it was also quite ambiguous in the public trials because of the people involved in these crimes. Beyond the Germans themselves, there was also the health personnel, the Soviet health medical staff, and this was a problem to show that too publicly too. So these kind of crimes were dealt with in bigger trial involving the foreign war criminals, and there are many crimes on a given area. So that's how the master narrative of the war evolved until, and I would like to conclude on this point, until a new attention was brought to this in the 60s, well, beginning already in the late 50s under Prof and also his foe, his new attention for the individual experience of the war, etc. And new, very high stage trials were organized from 58, 59 onwards. They were very intense in the 60s. Of course, there were less the workers were much less than in the 40s because there was only now the people involved in the worst crimes that were prosecuted. The other had been amnestied in the 50s. And in these trials, there were no more public executions at the end, but there was still this active participation of the public in this demonstration of justice and the evocation of the various categories of victims and suffering that the war had imposed on the country. My last word would be to say that one of the presently most dynamic line of research deals with not so much the organization by the state of these show trials or didactic trials or whatever level of control they were submitted to, but in fact the involvement of the society, various groups of the society, from the professionals of the media to the various legal professionals, and involving also various groups of survivors or just neighbors or people who lived through the occupation and wanted accountability. And the values and the reasons for which accountability was demanded in these trials, and the more or less successful compromise that they got from the authorities, who still kept the control on the narrative and the script of the trials, is the topic of a new line of research with colleagues in Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. Thanks a lot for your attention.